Conversation with the Candidate continues.
Welcome back to Conversation with the Candidate and Mayor Pete Buttigieg of South Bend, Indiana. We want to get right to our questions from our town hall studio audience here, and we're going to start with Mr. William Coder.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm wondering what in your experience demonstrates the political and people skills needed to get your programs through Congress?
Well, thank you. Obviously, the next president is going to have to take an ambitious legislative strategy and actually get it through. First of all, that's the bread and butter of what somebody in an executive role like mayor does. I mean, if I want to get anything done, from passing a budget that's upwards of $300 million in South Bend to making an organizational change to an administration that I'm supposed to run, I've got to convince a legislative body to do the same thing. Now, the challenge when it comes to the Congress is that Congress is in some ways structurally uneven because the districts are drawn in such a way that members of Congress often get to choose their voters instead of the other way around. And so I think we'll be pushing uphill, especially if you have a progressive set of policy goals in order to get that through. But I also think we learned in the 2018 midterm elections that people, even in traditionally more conservative districts, are expecting more from members of Congress than they've gotten so far. And a president, I think, who is skillful in this way can go into individual districts if necessary and mobilize people who really want to see these changes happen, want to see a higher minimum wage, want to see everybody able to get health care, want to see democratic reforms to our institutions before it's too late, and want to see action on things like climate change. And I believe that a skillful president, and I believe I have the skills to do this, can move people, mobilize them, and create pressure to where Congress has no choice but to do the right thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. William, thank you. Our next question comes from Carolyn Morrill.
Hi. Welcome to New Hampshire.
Thank you.
As you know, we pay the highest prescription drug prices. How will you specifically work to help lower the price for all Americans?
Thank you. The prescription drug crisis is alarming right now, and it's put life-saving drugs sometimes out of reach for so many. Part of the challenge, I think, has to do with making sure that the underlying costs are under control. For example, allowing Medicare to negotiate on drug prices is a policy that to me represents common sense. We may also need to adjust what's being done around some of the windows on patents. We want pharmaceutical companies that come up with life-saving drugs, of course, to be motivated to continue to do so. But sometimes you can tell just by some of these preposterous explosions in the cost of some drugs that it's not about that. It's simply about the profit motive. And I also think that at the end of the day, we've got to make sure that the costs that the consumers face is managed by having more readily available health care for all. And it's one of the reasons why I believe we need a Medicare solution that moves us in the direction of Medicare for all by allowing more people to get a robust public option on the exchange that would help the out-of-pocket costs for these drug purchases come under control.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Carol. Our next question comes from Frank Zito.
If you're fortunate enough to be the Democratic nominee and you're in a debate with Donald Trump, how would you respond to a typical nasty, negative, personal, verbal attack he would make against you? And assuming that you're in the debate, would you be comfortable using his first name and him using your first name? So instead of elevating him to Mr. President, since he'd be a candidate at that time, comfortable calling him Donald and him calling you Pete?
I guess he's going to call me whatever he is going to call me, and I probably don't have that much to say about it. I hadn't thought about the other question. I have a lot of respect for the office, so I'm not sure I'd be prepared to do that. But I also think that we need to make sure that this debate isn't about him. One of the things I've noticed is that all the critical attention that goes his way, he has a way of just kind of devouring it and absorbing it and growing even bigger from it. And so I think the nominee is going to have to strike a very important balance where on one hand, when he does something false, you obviously have to correct it. When he does something wrong, you got to confront it. But in many ways, we have to talk about a world where he's going to come and go. Because in my view, a presidency like this doesn't just happen. Somebody like him would not have even come within cheating distance of the presidency unless there were profound problems in our economy and our democratic system that made people, people where I live, for example, angry enough to vote to burn the house down. As far as the name calling, I think we've got to be tough without emulating the thing that we're fighting. And as somebody who dealt with incoming rocket fire when I was in the military, and frankly, just as somebody who's gay and grew up in Indiana, I'm pretty comfortable dealing with bullies too. So I think I can handle it, but I do think that it'll be important for the nominee to learn how to strike that balance well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Frank. We now have a social media question coming in from Nathaniel Cook. He asks, how can this country afford and adjust to the Green New Deal in such a short amount of time?
Yeah. So let's begin by being honest about the Green New Deal, which is that it is a set of goals more than it is a fully articulated plan about how we're going to reach those goals. But here's what I think the Green New Deal gets right. Number one, it correctly identifies that this is an emergency, a true national emergency, of the same proportions in terms of its destructive power as something like the Great Depression or even a world war. And we need to mount the same level of national resources that we would to deal with something on the order of a war. The other thing that it gets right is it recognizes that there's economic promise in doing so. So there are questions about affordability, but let's also talk about the opportunity that it creates. You know, part of how we ended the Great Depression was actually the investments that were made to win World War II. But it shouldn't take a war in order to mount that kind of effort. And what's so promising about the Green New Deal framework is it identifies that jobs can be created. I mean, in my community right now, in our county, one of the biggest recent additions of union auto worker jobs was for a facility that's producing electric vehicles for a startup out of California. So there are ways that everybody can win in this. Of course it's expensive, but not nearly as expensive as doing nothing. And when people ask, you know, is 2030, for example, the right year to reach some of these carbon targets? Look, scientifically, the right timing to reach those targets was yesterday. So anything we do is almost too late. And the question really is, do we have it in us as a country? And I believe we do. I believe in America enough to insist that we do, to mount the kind of effort that would fully transform our economy. And shame on us if we don't, because unlike the Great Depression and unlike World War II, this is one that we actually see coming.
Our next question comes from Christine Carter of Concord.
Hello.
Hi. What's your foreign policy philosophy? Do you believe that the United States should pull out of foreign entanglements to preserve our liberal order, or commit to our allies in order to preserve the liberal world order?
Well, thank you. The next president is going to have a lot of work to do to reestablish a good direction for American foreign policy. I'm not sure America has a foreign policy right now. And as somebody who was deployed to war on the orders of a president, I know how important those policies can be. The first thing the next president is going to have to do is identify a standard for commitment of American force. And I believe that that standard has been far too loose in my lifetime. Even now we see saber rattling around Venezuela as though it were appropriate to threaten U.S. military force there, even though there's no indication that that would contribute to anything, and certainly not that it rises to the level where American lives ought to be on the line. Obviously, we have military power for a reason, and we should be prepared to use it when there is an existential threat or when there is no other choice. But there has to be a higher standard, and there has to be a pathway to ending endless war. Another thing we've got to do is reestablish U.S. credibility in the world. You could see in the isolation of the U.S. at the Munich Security Conference, for example, what happens when we lose our credibility. And I felt it. I mean, when I was deployed, one of the things that kept me safe was that I knew that the flag that was on my shoulder represented a country that kept its word. And our allies believed that, and our enemies believed that. And just as much as my body armor, that's something that helped keep me safe. So we have to participate in a world order. We can either resent the rest of the world, or we can lead it. But we can't do both. And the next president is going to have to establish an American leadership role, which means we begin with American interests. We always consult American values to make sure that what we think is in our interests is consistent with those values. And then, whenever we responsibly can, we vet those actions, grounded in our interests, motivated by our values, with American allies. Because without our allies, it won't be America first, it will be America alone. Thanks.
Thank you, Christine. Our next question comes from Gail Taylor.
Mayor, would you support overturning Citizens United?
Yes. I guess I get a little more time to attack that question. So let me say, but I think it shouldn't be difficult, because that decision, I think, was a disaster for our democracy. You know, if dollars can outvote people, if companies have the same rights as citizens, then our democracy will be out of whack, because economic power will turn into political power. And countries where that happens, it's never good. And I fear that, I would hate for mine to be a generation that actually sees American democracy retreating, when so much of the American trajectory over history has been watching our country become more democratic, make it easier to vote, and give more power to more people. By the way, an honest answer to your question has to mention that it might not be possible without a constitutional amendment.
Oh, right.
So let's have a constitutional amendment. This is a country that once changed our Constitution in order to make it illegal to drink. And then realized that was a bad idea and changed it back, right? So why wouldn't we consider constitutional amendments to fortify our democracy when our democracy is the thing that keeps us safe and, frankly, in my view, the thing that makes America America?
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gail. Our next question comes from Brenda Bouchard.
Hi. My husband passed away in 2017 after having lived with younger onset Alzheimer's disease for 12 and a half years. Thank you. My mother has Alzheimer's, and my sister was diagnosed with Alzheimer's last summer. By 2050, it's anticipated 14 million Americans will be living with Alzheimer's or related dementia at a projected cost of $1.1 trillion. So how will you deal with that public health crisis and the strain that it is and will continue to put on our federal and state budgets?
Well, first of all, thank you for speaking out about that issue. I'm so sorry that it's touched your family in so many ways. Someone I care about back home is going through this right now. And it's a cruel disease, exceptionally cruel. And so we need to support people who are dealing with that or whose loved ones are dealing with that. The cost that you mentioned is enormous. Someone today, actually, who I encountered this morning, said that there was something like a $290 billion annual cost even now, if I heard him right. And that would suggest that we should be investing at a much higher level in order to deal with these things. You know, when something is a national priority, I'm told, for example, the moon landing project, that in today's dollars would amount to something like $10 billion a year. I don't know what the exact right amount is for R&D, but I'm pretty sure it ought to be more than we're doing right now. There's a reason why the National Institutes for Health and the CDC exist. There are some things that the market just doesn't take care of on its own. And we hope that the pharmaceutical industry can come up with solutions too, but we can't just let the corporate world handle it all, not when it's that important. And we also need to make sure that long-term care and memory care are better understood through our system, because as you likely have experienced, memory care is so demanding. It's more than anything that any other form of kind of in-home nursing care or traditional nursing home care can really accommodate. And my sense is that our current structure for health insurance and the way that healthcare is provided doesn't really recognize that, and certainly doesn't take into account the dimensions of what the statistics you just mentioned about how this issue, until we finally, God willing, find a cure, what it's going to take to accommodate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brenda, thank you for your question. Another social media question, this one coming from the rightward end of the political spectrum. Jeff Cease asks, will he try to infringe on our Second Amendment rights like the rest of the Dems?
Second Amendment's going to be just fine. And I come from a community and a state where we take Second Amendment rights seriously. And the Second Amendment is something that's been part of our Constitution the whole time. Now, I will say this. We have sometimes allowed the debate to get skewed. So, for example, universal background checks. This is something that 90% of Americans, from what I can tell, 80% of Republicans, the vast majority of gun owners, think makes sense. I mean, most of us think that you ought to be able to demonstrate who you are in order to get a weapon, that we ought to keep it out of the hands of people who could be dangerous, people with certain kinds of convictions, people who are on a terrorism watch list. I mean, this is common sense. And it is, in my view, fully compatible with the Second Amendment. Look, the Second Amendment didn't say you can't restrict any access to any arms, right? We've decided as a society that somewhere in between a slingshot and a nuclear weapon, we're going to draw a line. And we can argue over what that line's going to be, but we're all doing it in good faith within the Second Amendment. But I got to tell you, when 90% of Americans want something like background checks to be universal, and the U.S. Congress can't deliver, when Washington can't do something that most of us think is common sense. Same with things around gun trafficking or what was happening with NICS, the registry that we use, red flag laws to help flag people with spousal abuse histories or mental health issues. If we can't deliver on that, that's not just about this issue, it's about our democracy. Look, I swear in police officers. I'm there when they're sworn in. And their spouses are at their side. And their children are sometimes there. And I don't want them to be at a disadvantage keeping our neighborhoods safe because we can't enact common sense gun safety policy that is both constitutional and has been tested and is known to reduce the risk of people coming to harm.
Our next question comes from Aaron Fowler of Derry.
Hi.
Hello. In no other circumstances in America are controlled substances used for both medicinal and recreational use, which is the case with some marijuana in some states. Are you concerned about the message legalizing marijuana sends And would you approve recreational legalization in the United States?
I think that is the direction we need to move in. And I don't want to be naive about the harms that can come with addiction to marijuana or the harms that can come from smoking really anything. Those ought to be taken seriously. And at the same time, I think it's clear that the policies we've had around marijuana have done more harm than good. You look at rates of incarceration, you look at the racial disparity that is attached to whether somebody is likely to experience incarceration as a consequence of a nonviolent drug offense. And all of it, I think, points us in the same direction. So I don't believe this is something that should be taken lightly, but I do believe that we need to remove many of these restrictions and in a free country, place a little more weight on this issue, on personal responsibility.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, another social media question coming in. Joel Prescott asks, will he accept PAC money?
Nope. I will not accept corporate PAC money. If workers are paying into an organization and they want somebody to stand up for them, that's a different story. But I've decided not to accept corporate PAC money, which is one of the reasons why I should mention we're really counting on folks at the grassroots fundraising level, if they want me to be on that debate stage, to go on over to peteforamerica.com and lend a hand at any level.
So what other sort of distinctions would you like to make in terms of taking campaign contributions? Some emphasized more than others, I guess.
You know, I'm not comfortable taking fossil fuel contributions either. But one of the things I've realized is the clearer I am about my message, probably more, if you want to call it nefarious money or inappropriate money, probably not likely to be coming my way anyway. So what I'm trying to do is just have the right message and then trust within those restrictions I just mentioned to you, trust that people will decide based on their values who they want to contribute to. I just hope that we can make it more and more of a grassroots thing and really invite people contributing at any level to make that statement, especially because the DNC has said in order to be invited to the debate, you've got to show that you have 65,000 individual contributions from different people. Any level, could be $3, but at that kind of range. And maybe that's a healthy push because it's better than having us think that fundraising is all about getting a handful of people to write the biggest possible checks.
All right, one last quick social media question. Peter Skawira asks, can we see your taxes?
Sure, yeah, we'll make that happen.
Okay, all right.
I'm still doing my taxes right now, but we'll make it. And
as are most of us.
It's not that exciting. I mean, I'm a mayor and I'm married to a teacher, but yeah, sure.
With about a minute left here, I just want to ask you, when someone says Afghanistan, who is the person in that country that you think about?
Wow. Well, mostly I think about the people I served with. Some of them are still there, and extraordinary people in civilians and the military. And I think about the faces of the people that I would see. So part of my job in Afghanistan, I had a very kind of complicated military-style title as an intelligence officer doing counterterrorism. The truth is my most important job was Uber. I was driving. I was driving and sometimes guarding vehicles. And what it meant was that I saw this city, Kabul. And as a mayor, you always think about cities as a mayor. So you saw what happened in a community where they didn't have trash pickup like we do. And trash would pile up on the side of the road. And they couldn't necessarily count on safety or clean water, even things like animal control. I used to have to swerve around packs of dogs sometimes in the downtown. And you realize just how important those conditions of living are.
And this is a great conversation which we will continue online and on our mobile app. Mayor Pete, thanks so much for joining us. We'll have Marianne Williamson next week, but hop on over to our mobile app and online to watch the rest of this conversation.